It is 12:14 in the morning on the 26th of September, 1983, and Stanislav Petrov is sitting in a chair he has sat in hundreds of times before. The bunker is called Serpukhov 15. It sits south of Moscow, underground, and its job is simple and terrible. Watch the sky over the United States and report what you see. Petrov is the duty officer tonight. He is 44 years old. He has a cigarette. He has coffee that has gone cold. He has a room full of screens, and on one of those screens, an alarm begins. The word that appears is not subtle. It says, "Launch." The Soviet early warning satellite system, code named OKO, has detected what it believes is an American Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile rising from its silo in the United States. Then a second, then a third. The alarm escalates to its highest level. The system is not whispering, it is screaming. Protocol is clear. Petrov's job is not to decide whether the missiles are real. His job is to report upward, to pass the alarm to Soviet military command, who would pass it to the leadership, who would then have minutes, perhaps less, to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike before the incoming missiles hit. In a launch-on warning system, speed is everything. Hesitation is the thing that gets you killed. Petrov does not report upward. He sits with the alarm for what must have been the longest minutes of his life, and he thinks about what a real American first strike would look like. It would not be 5 missiles. It would be hundreds, arriving from submarines, from silos, from bombers, a coordinated erasure, not a warning shot. 5 missiles made no military sense, and the system he knew was new. It had not been fully tested. It had problems. He picks up the phone and tells his superiors the alarm is a malfunction. He is right. The satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off the tops of clouds above Montana, for missile exhaust plumes. A geometry of light had nearly ended the world. Petrov is not celebrated. He is reprimanded mildly for improper record keeping on the night of the incident. He retires quietly. He gives one interview, years later, in which he says he does not feel like a hero because, he explains, he was simply doing his job. He was doing his job in the middle of the most dangerous machine ever built. One man doing his job correctly meant you are alive right now to hear this. But here is what you need to hold in your mind as we go through this. Petrov is not the only one. There is a man on a submarine, a Soviet officer in the dark, under the Caribbean Sea, in a vessel so hot the crew was losing consciousness. With no radio contact, with depth charges going off around him, who would face a vote that Petrov never had to face. A vote on whether to end the world. We will come back to him. But not yet. Here is the thing about nuclear weapons that nobody in any government has ever found a clean solution to. You cannot build a system designed to end civilization and also guarantee that system will never malfunction. These two things are in permanent conflict. The logic of nuclear deterrence requires that your weapons be ready to launch at a moment's notice, because if your enemy believes you need hours to prepare, they might calculate that a fast first strike could destroy your ability to retaliate before you even get started. So, the weapons have to be hair trigger. They have to be connected to detection systems that are always running, always watching, always ready to escalate. And detection systems, radar arrays, satellites, computers, are machines. Machines fail. Machines misread data. Machines do not understand context. You are building a system where a misread is indistinguishable from a real attack, and where the penalty for hesitating on a real attack is extinction. That is not a design flaw. That is the design. Here is what most people miss about the history of nuclear close calls. They are not rare exceptions. They are what physicists would call an expected output of the system. Between 1950 and 1980 alone, the United States military recorded over 30 significant nuclear accidents, events classified under the code name Broken Arrow. The Soviet Union kept its accidents even more tightly classified, which means we know even less about what almost happened on that side. But we know about North Carolina. On the 24th of January, 1961, 2 years before Petrov's night in the bunker, 1 year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, a B-52 Stratofortress bomber broke apart in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina. The plane was on a routine airborne alert mission. It was carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. Each bomb had a yield of approximately 4 megatons. For context, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was about 13 kilotons. A megaton is 1,000 kilotons. Each bomb over Goldsboro was roughly 250 times more powerful than the weapon that destroyed an entire city in 1945. When the aircraft broke apart, both bombs fell free. One bomb's parachute deployed. It drifted down and landed in a field. When recovery teams reached it, they found that it had cycled through 5 of its 6 arming mechanisms during the fall. 5 of 6. The only thing standing between a 4-megaton detonation in rural North Carolina, a blast that would have been felt as far away as Washington, D.C., that would have sent a fallout plume across the eastern seaboard, was a single low-voltage safety switch. A weapons designer who worked on the Mark 39 later described that switch to a journalist as a simple old component, the kind of part that belongs in a pocket flashlight, not in the last line of defense between a nuclear detonation and a major American population center. The switch held. The other bomb was not so tidy. It fell without a parachute. It hit the ground at high speed and buried itself, along with most of its components, deep in the waterlogged farmland of Wayne County. The Air Force excavated the site for weeks. They never recovered the secondary stage, the part of the bomb containing the uranium core. It is, as of the last public record, still there, under a field. In North Carolina, the Air Force holds an easement on the land and prohibits deep drilling. You are living on a planet where a piece of a hydrogen bomb is buried in American farmland because a routine flight went wrong in 1961. This is not history. This is infrastructure. 9 years after Petrov, 8 years after North Carolina, the United States nearly launched a nuclear response to an attack that existed only inside a computer. It is the 9th of November, 1979. The time is 8:50 in the morning. Inside NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, built inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, an analyst is watching data come across his screen. The data says the Soviet Union has launched a full-scale nuclear strike against the United States. Not a few missiles, hundreds, submarine, launched, land-based, a coordinated wave, the kind of attack that strategic planners call a bolt from the blue. The National Military Command Center goes to alert. Missile crews are notified. The command aircraft that would carry senior leadership aloft to survive a first wave and coordinate retaliation is prepared for immediate takeoff. Generals are woken up. It takes 6 minutes to figure out what happened. A training tape, a simulation program designed to practice NORAD's response to exactly this kind of attack, had been accidentally fed into the live warning system. The data the analysts were seeing was not real. It was a rehearsal. But the system had no label on it that said rehearsal. It displayed simulation data identically to the way it would have displayed real incoming missiles. 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, decisions get made that cannot be unmade. The NORAD incident was investigated, corrected, and classified. 4 months later, almost the same thing happened again. On the 3rd of June 1980, a faulty computer chip, a chip that cost less than 46 cents, caused the warning system to display intermittent false launch signals. The alert went out again. Missile crews were notified again. The problem was traced to the chip within minutes, but those minutes existed. They were real minutes, inside a real command structure, with real human beings holding real authority. Now hold that thought, because 1983 gave the world something worse than a false alarm. It gave the world a real one. In November of that year, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to simulate a coordinated nuclear release, to rehearse the exact sequence of commands that would authorize a strike, from conventional conflict escalation all the way to the final authorization code. It was thorough, realistic, and unprecedented in its detail. The Soviet Union did not know it was an exercise. Or rather, Soviet military intelligence knew it was an exercise on paper. But the KGB and GRU had been watching NATO with increasing paranoia throughout 1983. In September of that year, the same month as Petrov's night, a Soviet fighter jet had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 people on board after mistaking it for a spy plane. The geopolitical temperature was already near the breaking point. Soviet leadership, and particularly the aging and increasingly paranoid Yuri Andropov, had become genuinely convinced that the United States might be planning a nuclear first strike under cover of a military exercise. Able Archer 83 fit the profile perfectly. Soviet forces in East Germany were placed on a state of readiness that NATO analysts, reviewing declassified records later, described as unprecedented. Nuclear-capable aircraft were armed, communication patterns changed, the machinery of retaliation was warming up in response to a war game. What saved the situation? What gave Western intelligence the window to understand how close things had come was a British intelligence asset inside the KGB named Oleg Gordievsky. Gordievsky had been passing information to Mi-6 for years. His reporting on the Soviet reaction to Able Archer reached Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Reagan, by some accounts, was genuinely shaken. He had not understood until that moment that the Soviet leadership might actually, sincerely, believe the United States was about to attack them. That gap in understanding, between what each side believed about the other, was very nearly fatal. If you are finding this hard to hold, I understand. These are not stories that fit neatly into a worldview where catastrophe is something that happens to other people in other centuries. These happened in living memory. Some of the people who were in those command centers are still alive. The systems that produced these moments have been modified, but they have not been dismantled. Which brings us back to the submarine. You know, the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, October 1962, the 13 days, Kennedy and Khrushchev, the blockade, the negotiations, the moment the world held its breath. What you almost certainly do not know is that the crisis had a dimension that was completely invisible to the public, to most of the American government, and to historians for decades afterward. There were 4 Soviet submarines in the Caribbean. Each one was carrying a nuclear torpedo, a weapon with a yield roughly equivalent to the Hiroshima bomb. The submarines had been sent from the Soviet Union before the crisis began as part of a routine deployment, and they were now trapped. The U.S. Navy had found them. American destroyers and aircraft carriers were hunting them, tracking them, forcing them to the surface, using a tactic that involved dropping small signaling depth charges, non-lethal explosives designed to communicate through the vibration of water that the submarine needed to come up. The submarines did not know these were signaling charges. They had not been told this protocol existed. From inside a Soviet submarine, A depth charge is a depth charge. And inside Submarine B-59, things had become very bad. The vessel had been running submerged for days. It was equipped with diesel engines that required surfacing to recharge its batteries, but surfacing meant detection. The crew had not surfaced, the batteries were running low, the air recycling system was failing. The temperature inside the submarine had climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were rising. Crew members were losing consciousness. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, had not been able to reach Moscow by radio for days. He did not know what was happening above him. He did not know whether the Soviet Union was already at war. And then the depth charges began. Savitsky made a decision if they were being attacked, and what else could this be? Then they were at war, and if they were at war, he had both the authority and the weapon to respond. The nuclear torpedo on B-59 did not require a launch code from Moscow. Under the operational rules the submarine had sailed with, Savitsky had the authority to fire it himself. He needed agreement from 2 other senior officers on board. He went to the political officer first. The political officer agreed, 2 votes to launch. The third officer was Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov was not the captain of B-59. He was the chief of staff of the entire submarine flotilla, senior in overall rank to Savitsky. Though not in command of the vessel, he was 36 years old. He had survived a near-catastrophic reactor accident aboard another submarine the year before, an incident that had irradiated much of his crew, an incident he had stayed aboard to help manage when he could have evacuated. He was not a man who panicked. He voted no. He argued, in a submarine filled with unconscious crewmen, with depth charges going off in the water around them. With a captain who was convinced they were already at war, he argued that the situation was ambiguous, that they could not confirm hostilities, that they needed to surface and make contact before they did something that could not be undone. Savitsky argued back. The political officer argued back. Arkhipov did not change his vote. Without unanimity, under their operational rules, the torpedo could not be launched. B-59 surfaced. American aircraft circled overhead. The submarine was damaged, humiliated, exposed. But it was alive. The world above it was alive. The Cuban Missile Crisis resolved, eventually, through negotiation, and the most dangerous moment within it. The moment that came closest to actual nuclear detonation happened underwater, in the dark, in a boat most people have never heard of, decided by a vote of 2-1. Thomas Blanton, a historian at the National Security Archive, who helped declassify the Arkhipov story, put it plainly. A man named Vasili Arkhipov saved the world, not the president, not the general secretary. A 36-year-old Soviet naval officer on a submarine that was running out of air. This is what the history actually looks like when you read all of it. Look at what you have now. Petrov, alone in a bunker, choosing to trust his instinct over his instrument. Arkhipov, in a failing submarine, holding a vote that 2 other men wanted to go the other way. An anonymous Air Force crew over North Carolina, riding a disintegrating aircraft, releasing bombs that nearly armed themselves on the way down. A 46-cent computer chip at NORAD, a NATO war game that Soviet intelligence read as a preparation for genocide. These events spanned 22 years. They happened on different continents, inside different command structures, involving different weapons, different political crises, different technologies. And they share one thing that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. This is not a story about nuclear weapons. This is not a story about the Cold War. This is not a story about Soviet recklessness or American overconfidence. This is a story about what happens when human beings build systems too large and too fast and too tightly wound for any individual inside them to fully understand, and then place those systems under the most extreme pressure imaginable and expect them to perform without error. Every single close call in this history contains the same architecture, a detection system that cannot distinguish between reality and simulation, connected to a command system that cannot afford to pause and verify, operated by human beings who are sleep-deprived, undertrained, overwhelmed, or cut off from the information they need to make a clear decision. The system is not designed to allow for reflection. It is designed to move. Robert McNamara, the U.S. Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the architects of the deterrence strategy that governed these decades, spent the last years of his life saying publicly what he could not say in office. He said that we came that close to nuclear war, not once, not twice, but multiple times, and that in almost every case, the reason we survived was luck. He said luck, not strategy, not deterrence theory, not the rational actor model that political scientists built entire careers on. Luck, the luck of one man on duty on one night in Moscow, the luck of a ranking officer being on the right submarine at the right moment, the luck of a safety switch holding in a field in North Carolina. And here is what keeps serious analysts awake today. The variables have changed, but the architecture has not. There are now 9 countries with nuclear weapons. Command and control systems are more automated than they were in 1983. Early warning satellites and radar arrays run on software written by human beings who make mistakes. The doctrine of launch on warning, the hair trigger posture that made Petrov's situation possible, remains in place. And the geopolitical temperature of recent years has moved in directions that rhyme uncomfortably with the temperature of 1983. Pay attention to this, not as a reason to despair, but as a reason to understand what kind of world you are actually living in, rather than the cleaned-up version that gets presented in textbooks and ceremonies. The people who know this history best are not the most frightened. They are the most precise. They understand that these systems can be changed, have been changed slowly through arms control treaties and hotlines and confidence, building measures and individual acts of political courage. They understand that the margin has been managed before, and they understand that managing it requires knowing it exists. 3 things to carry with you. The first, the individual inside the system is not irrelevant. Everything in deterrence theory, everything in political science, everything in the doctrine of mutually assured destruction is built on the assumption of rational states making rational calculations. What the history actually shows is that the state, at the critical moment, is one person. One person with incomplete information, under pressure, in the dark, making a decision that will determine whether the rest of the decisions ever get made at all. Petrov is not a footnote. Arkhipov is not a footnote. They are the story. The second, perfect machines are the most dangerous machines. The close calls that came from obvious malfunction, the chip, the training tape, the satellite misreading sunlight, were recoverable because someone noticed something was wrong. The close calls that came from systems performing exactly as designed, Able Archer, the launch-on warning posture, the nuclear torpedo authority that Savitsky held, were harder to stop. Because everything was working, the danger was not in the failure. The danger was in the design. The third, and the one I want you to sit with, we do not name the people who saved us. We build monuments to the generals and the presidents and the strategists who constructed these weapons and deployed these systems and played this game across decades of geopolitical chess. And somewhere, not in any monument, not on any memorial wall, there is Stanislav Petrov going home to an apartment in a Moscow suburb, reprimanded for paperwork. There is Vasili Arkhipov, who died in 1998 from radiation-related illness, from the reactor accident on the submarine the year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, buried in a cemetery in Russia. His name unknown to the vast majority of the people whose lives his vote preserved. You are here because of people you have never been asked to remember. That seems worth knowing.